I began this assignment with the same detached focus I bring to every rural incident report, telling myself that this trip to the outskirts of Haverly Ridge would be a routine follow-up, a simple attempt to collect first-hand impressions for a story that had already burned itself out in local news cycles. Yet as I drove the last 10 kilometers past the tree line, the sense of something unfinished pressed against the inside of my ribs like a dull, rhythmic tap. The official account described it as a disturbance event. A single farmhouse, 3 residents, repeated emergency calls abruptly cut off, and a responding deputy reporting structural vibrations before his radio failed. By the time backup arrived, the house was vacant, the power disconnected, and faint scorch marks, irregular and asymmetrical, marred the floorboards without any traceable ignition source. I had access to the preliminary case file through a contact at the county office, and it struck me as a typical small-town overreaction, the sort of messy but mundane situation that could be explained by electrical faults, substance use, or a domestic conflict someone tried to dress up with dramatic language. Still, the wording in the deputy's written statement lingered with me. He described hearing a cyclic hum from beneath the property, not mechanical, not electrical, almost felt rather than heard. He insisted on that phrasing as though afraid someone would misquote him, though the department later attributed his report to stress and heat exposure. My editors didn't want a sensational angle, only an atmospheric long-form piece about rural emergency response gaps. But I knew enough about these isolated communities to understand how rumors metastasize when left unexamined. So the goal was simply to walk the site, speak with the neighbors if any would come to the door, and catalog the environment with an objective lens. Even as I parked by the overgrown ditch, I repeated that to myself. Document, don't interpret. The property looked abandoned, but not decayed. The porch boards were swollen from the recent rains. The curtains hung motionless, and the yard seemed oddly flattened in places, not trampled, not mowed, just pressed down like tall grass after a heavy snow despite the mild weather of the past week. The air felt dry despite the muddy tracks leading toward the barn, and the silence had a density to it, almost like the moment inside a sound booth when the insulation swallows every echo. I recorded my initial impressions aloud, noting the details for later transcription, and approached the main structure with steady steps, feeling the usual mix of professional detachment and mild apprehension that accompanies any site linked to a missing persons case. Inside, the odor surprised me first. Not rot, not mold, but something faintly metallic, similar to the scent on old recording tape when the reels have been handled too often. The living room remained undisturbed. Dust settled neatly, no signs of struggle, and the scorch pattern on the floor seemed less dramatic than the file photos had suggested, though when I crouched closer it became clear the marks weren't so much burned as discolored, the grain of the wood subtly warped in an inconsistent direction, almost as if heat had traveled sideways. I felt no warmth, no residue. Yet my recorder picked up a thin distortion when I spoke near the affected boards, a slight flutter at the edge of the waveform I couldn't hear with my own ears. I attributed it to interference from my equipment, made a note to check the microphone casing later, and continued toward the back hallway. There were shoes by the door, neatly aligned, 3 pairs corresponding to the residents listed in the file, and dust patterns suggested they had not been moved since the disappearance. But something about the spacing looked off, as though someone had placed them down with careful measurement rather than natural habit. A small framed photograph lay face down on a dresser, likely fallen, not deliberately placed. And when I lifted it, the image revealed the family posing near the barn, but the print was strangely dim, almost underexposed, even though the timestamp on the corner indicated a bright afternoon. I dismissed the thought as my eyes adjusting to the low light. Yet as I moved through each room, I kept catching myself pausing, trying to locate the source of a faint impression that something about the house was imitating a normal lived-in space without fully understanding what lived-in meant. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, the air had become noticeably stiller, and the metallic tang returned, stronger now, though still too subtle to categorize. I reached for the back door handle, and as my fingers touched the metal, I felt a vibration, not strong enough to be mechanical, but distinct, a tremor that lasted half a second before fading. The ground outside looked undisturbed, the barn door slightly ajar, and from this vantage point, I could see only the shadows pooled across the interior. I told myself it was wind pressure on the old frame, but the air remained motionless. I recorded the observation with deliberate neutrality, yet a small detail tugged at me. On the threshold, barely visible unless I angle my head, the wood bore faint indentations, pairs of them, evenly spaced, too symmetrical to be from boots, too shallow to match animal prints, as if something had pressed there repeatedly with precise, measured weight. I started to say the marks were likely from old equipment or tools, but the sentence trailed off of my recorder because I couldn't finish it with confidence. It wasn't fear taking shape yet, only the quiet recognition that the simple story I came here to confirm might not be simple at all, and that the deeper I moved into the property, the more the facts began to feel like they were rearranging themselves in ways I wasn't prepared to classify. I spent the next hours moving methodically between the documents gathered from the county archive and the physical impressions I continued to collect on site, forcing myself to maintain a neutral cadence in my notes, even as the inconsistencies accumulated in ways that resisted clean categorization. The timeline in the emergency call log showed 3 separate attempts to contact dispatch, each cut off at precisely the 9-second mark. And though the official assessment attributed the interruptions to line degradation, the audio spectrogram supplied by the technician exhibited a narrow band of interference that repeated across all 3 calls, a thin ascending pattern resembling mechanical telemetry rather than static. When I mentioned this to the technician, he simply said that rural infrastructure was unpredictable, yet in the same breath he admitted he had never seen that specific profile before, and his expression suggested he preferred not to dwell on it. I reviewed the deputy's body cam file despite the department claiming it malfunctioned. The video was indeed black, but the audio channel contained intermittent pulses spaced at near regular intervals, faint enough that most listeners would dismiss them as compression errors. What caught my attention was that the intervals matched the temporal spacing of the indentations I measured on the threshold earlier, although I could not justify that comparison beyond a subjective impression. I recorded the observation anyway, aware that it might later require retraction. Moving through the barn, I found the interior unnaturally neat considering the abrupt disappearance of its owners. Tools were arranged with near-perfect alignment, dust forming consistent gradients as though the space had not been used but had been carefully presented. A local handyman I spoke to described the family as disorganized and often late on repairs, a discrepancy that seemed minor at first, yet felt relevant, as I noted how every surface in the barn appeared intentionally curated, lacking the fingerprints and smudges one would expect after years of use. When I asked him about the scorch marks in the house, he shook his head and offered a short explanation about faulty wiring, though he admitted no one in town had ever known the family to handle electrical work themselves. He added that people had heard odd tremors the night the calls were made, low enough that residents assumed it was construction equipment on the ridge, although there had been no scheduled work that week. I included his statements in my notes with caution, categorizing them as anecdotal and subject to confirmation. By late afternoon, I returned to the farmhouse and conducted a second walkthrough, comparing the earlier photographs to the current arrangement. A few small items had shifted by centimeters, A ceramic mug rotated slightly on the counter, a door that I swore I had left half open now resting flush against the frame, a curtain edge misaligned with the dust coating on the sill. I attempted to rationalize each change: settling of the foundation, airflow from the cross ventilation, personal misperception. Yet the cumulative effect produced a quiet pressure at the base of my throat, a sense that the environment was not static, but responsive in ways I could not document without sounding speculative. To counter that drift, I increased the precision of my notes, logging temperature readings, humidity levels, and the orientation of objects in each room. Still, a pattern emerged that I was reluctant to articulate. The metallic odor intensified in correlation with my movement through the house, not tied to any specific room, but following with subtle shifts, as if the origin point kept relocating just out of sight. I checked the air vents for contaminants, found none, tested my recorder for battery leakage, again found nothing. As daylight began to lower, I walked the perimeter of the property and noted that the flattened grass patches I observed earlier had slightly expanded, the edges soft and irregular like the outline of something settling deeper into the soil. A neighbor from across the field approached briefly, keeping more distance than necessary, and told me that lights had been seen on the property 2 nights ago, thin white beams sweeping the interior walls despite the power being cut. He insisted it was probably kids trespassing, though he admitted no footprints were found afterward, and his tone shifted in a way that suggested he no longer fully believed his own explanation. I included his statement as well, marking it for later verification. When I reached the back door again, the earlier vibration I felt on the handle repeated, slightly stronger this time. No wind, no mechanical source, just a brief, controlled tremor. I checked the ground around the porch, and those paired indentations had multiplied, faint but numerous, stretching outward across the dirt in a pattern that appeared almost directional. I attempted to trace their alignment, but they did not form a recognizable path, only an expanding field of paired impressions that ended abruptly near the barn, as though whatever produced them had paused or altered course. I documented every measurement, every angle, every anomaly with the detached focus expected of investigative reporting. Yet even as I repeated the procedures, I felt a subtle shift in the ambient stillness, a tightening of the air that suggested the property was no longer merely a subject of observation, but was beginning, in some incremental way, to respond to being observed. And the distinction between evidence and presence became momentarily difficult to articulate. I re-entered the house at dusk with the intention of completing a structured sweep of the restricted zones I had marked earlier, focusing primarily on the crawlspace access beneath the kitchen and the sealed storage room adjoining the barn, both of which had shown temperature fluctuations on my earlier readings that I could not attribute to environmental changes. The air inside had grown heavier since afternoon, not warmer, but denser, carrying that same metallic undertone now layered with something resembling ozone, faint yet persistent enough that I documented it as a potential indicator of electrical discharge despite having already confirmed the power was disconnected. I moved systematically through the interior, narrating each step for the recorder to maintain clarity later. Position, timestamp, observation, hypothesis, revision. The changes I had dismissed earlier, minor object shifts, subtle distortions in the audio, seemed more pronounced now, though I continued framing them within procedural language to avoid imposing an emotional narrative. When I reached the kitchen, I noted that the warped discoloration on the floorboards had expanded by several centimeters, not radiating outward as heat damage would, but following the grain in irregular, branching streaks that resembled stress fractures more than burn patterns. Kneeling with the flashlight, I felt a faint vibration through the wood, intermittent and localized, enough to register through the handle of the probe, but too weak to capture on audio. I removed the metal cover to the crawl space and was immediately struck by a current of cold air rising from below. Not a draft, but a steady upward push as though the space beneath was pressurized. My beam reached only a few meters before dissolving into particulate haze that appeared and vanished like fine dust suspended in still air, though no airflow was present to explain the motion. The walls below bore faint parallel scoring, consistent in spacing but shallow, as if something had passed repeatedly through the same narrow paths without deviating from them. I recorded the measurements and decided to proceed only far enough to confirm whether the source of the vibration was structural. The moment my weight shifted onto the first rung, the recorder picked up a distortion spike, a thin, oscillating whine that did not match any known interference pattern in my previous logs. I retreated, noting increased instability in both the audio and my subjective assessment, and redirected my examination toward the barn storage room. The structure itself seemed unchanged, but the paired impressions in the soil leading to it had deepened, still evenly spaced, now numerous enough to form overlapping rows. The interior of the storage room was markedly colder than the rest of the barn, and as I advanced with my light held low, I saw that the dust on the floor had been displaced into sweeping arcs that converged toward the back wall. Not random, not wind-driven, but patterned like the residue left by machinery. Except no machinery had been stored here in years according to the logs. Running my hand along the wall, I felt another vibration. This one longer, a low tremor that passed through the boards and into my arm with a slow, deliberate consistency, nothing like the jitter of failing equipment. Beneath the wall paneling, I detected a hollow resonance, and, after verifying stability, removed a segment using a pry tool from my kit. Behind it lay a narrow shaft, descending deeper than the property's original blueprints indicated, reinforced with metal struts too recently cut to match the age of the building. At approximately 1 meter down, a smooth surface reflected my light, curved and metallic, bearing the same branching discolorations observed in the kitchen floorboards, but arranged here in a coherent pattern, almost like a diagram etched through heat rather than by hand. When I reached out with the probe, the surface emitted a short, precise pulse, a single vibration that traveled up the tool, through my glove, and into my shoulder with unmistakable intention, as if acknowledging contact. The recorder captured the moment as a compressed pop followed by a thin harmonic tone that held for several seconds before fading into silence. I tried to repeat the test, but the surface had cooled, no longer reactive. Still, the atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly afterward, the cold deepening, the metallic odor sharpening to something closer to iron. I documented every detail as quickly as possible, aware that my hands had begun to shake and that maintaining consistency in the log required conscious effort. Before replacing the wall panel, I noticed that the arcs in the dust behind me were no longer symmetrical. They had elongated slightly, converging toward the shaft rather than away from it, as though responding to movement rather than creating it. Outside, the light had nearly vanished, and the soil impressions that had previously ended near the barn now extended several meters farther, their paired shapes more defined, the spacing more precise. I recorded all of it while moving steadily toward the house, noting that my equipment was beginning to register intermittent distortion without clear cause, and that the ambient vibrations, once subtle, now seemed to align with my movements, increasing in intensity whenever I paused. I am continuing to document with as much clarity as possible despite the progressive environmental instability. And while I cannot fully verify whether these changes reflect external conditions or internal misperception, the cumulative evidence suggests that whatever underlies this property is no longer confined to static locations. And the distinction between active observation and active response is beginning to collapse faster than I can categorize it. I am attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events with the limited clarity available to me, though the gaps in my memory and the degraded state of my equipment make this process increasingly unreliable. After the contact event in the storage shaft, I experienced a period of disorientation lasting an indeterminate amount of time. My recorder shows a continuous file with multiple segments of corrupted audio, each marked by the same harmonic interference that preceded the pulse through the probe, but no clear speech or environmental noise to help fill the blanks. When I regained full awareness, I was positioned near the north fence line with my field kit partially open on the ground and several tools missing, though I have no recollection of moving them or of traveling from the bar to the fence. My first instinct was to reestablish a stable perimeter and verify structural integrity of the house, but the interior appeared subtly altered, not in any dramatic or overtly hostile way, rather as though the objects had shifted into new configurations according to a logic that prioritized symmetry over utility. The mug on the counter now rested at a precise angle relative to the discolored floorboards, and the curtain that had previously hung unevenly had been pulled taut, forming a straight vertical line that did not match the position of the window frame. I documented these deviations despite my increasing inability to trust the accuracy of my observations. Several pages of notes written earlier in the day were smudged, the ink distorted in looping patterns I do not remember creating, and one page contained a diagram of the branching discolorations from a shaft. Yet the marks were sharper and more deliberate than my usual field sketches, almost etched into the paper rather than drawn. I attempted to corroborate my earlier measurements with the original case file, but discovered that 3 pages of the copied report had degraded, their text fading to faint outlines as though the toner had been stripped from the surface. The remaining pages contained inconsistencies I had not noticed the first time. The timestamps on the deputy's body cam malfunction report were misaligned by nearly 6 minutes, and the description of the scorch marks mentioned radial spreading rather than linear warping, a contradiction that should have been immediately obvious, yet which none of the officials seemed to acknowledge. When I tried to contact the technician who had provided the spectrograms earlier, his line produced only a quiet rhythmic clicking similar to the ascending interference on the emergency calls, and after several attempts the connection ceased responding at all. Whether this indicates a system error or deliberate disconnection, I cannot determine. As the evening progressed, I noted a significant increase in environmental instability around the property. The vibrations beneath the floorboards, once intermittent, became more frequent and more synchronized, forming a pattern that suggested an external source rather than structural decay. My attempts to record these pulses resulted in files that played back as near silence punctuated by sudden metallic chirps that seemed to shift position within the stereo field, though my device does not support directional audio. I should note here that my personal condition has deteriorated as well. Mild tremors in my hands, persistent pressure at the base of the skull, and episodes of momentary spatial disorientation similar to the sensation experienced in anechoic chambers, where the absence of ambient sound causes the brain to overcorrect. I cannot confirm whether these symptoms stem from exposure to environmental anomalies or from simple fatigue, but they have begun to interfere with the precision required for methodological documentation. Despite this, I continued efforts to consolidate all collected evidence, organizing physical samples, transcribing legible sections of the corrupted notes, and attempting once more to follow the tracks leading from the barn, though the paired impressions had multiplied beyond any pattern I could reliably map, forming overlapping sequences that terminated sharply near the southern tree line as though erased mid-stride. The soil around those endpoints appeared disturbed, not dug, not trampled, but shaped in shallow concave depressions consistent with downward pressure rather than horizontal movement. I recorded these findings with as much neutrality as possible, but I cannot deny a growing concern for personal safety given the cumulative nature of the irregularities. The metallic odor that followed me through the house earlier is now present on my clothes and equipment even after exposure to open air, and several surfaces inside the property exhibit faint iridescent sheens when struck by the flashlight, sheens that disappear when observed directly and reappear only in peripheral vision. My last coherent attempt to reestablish baseline environmental readings resulted in the handheld monitor freezing on a blank screen before emitting a short tonal sequence identical to the one captured during the pulse in the shaft. I have archived the recording separately, though I'm no longer confident the device can be trusted. At this point, I believe it necessary to conclude the report with the information still available, though the chronology is fractured and the supporting evidence incomplete. The environmental vibrations have intensified again, registering now not only through the floor but through the ground outside, subtle but constant, and the impressions in the soil nearest the porch are no longer paired but merged, elongated in a way that suggests vertical rather. I am losing the ability to maintain a stable record. The audio feed is generating interference independent of my movement, and the lights inside the house have begun to reflect patterns inconsistent with any known. I will attempt to relocate to a position with clearer noise increasing. If this file is recovered, the sequence should indicate the last stable. HHH. I am still trying to document. The ground is I need to